Então, nós
Cadê? Não está aqui o falante dele?
Ele está muito ruim.
Esses 3 minutos que faltam,
Como é que está o áudio?
nós estamos aqui hoje para fazer o lançamento oficial do engravamento. Um trabalho durante a presidência brasileira do G20 de 2024. Então, nós sabemos que tem vários grupos de engajamentos e o mundo do trabalho se reúne e trabalha a partir do L20.
Cada câmera.
A presença do nosso companheiro Diego,
fecha nele.
e segue o
Ana, fecha nele. Peraí, Bíblia, você não é.
Nosso companheiro
não, só não sei porquê.
A fundação fez
fecha, Bíblia. Fecha.
5 das 6 centrais esperando ainda a CDB está presente. E como eu sou professor, então se chegar atrasado, vai ser lá no fundo. Entendeu? Depois manda para a orientação educacional. Né? Eu fui avaliar chegar na hora, eu sei exatamente 2 horas para fazer essa discussão. Existem, como a gente pode ver já aqui na nossa tela, muita gente inscrita. Alguns irão participar pelo Zoom e outros pelo YouTube. Né? Sobre a tradução, nós vamos aqui na mesa falar em português e vai haver tradução para inglês. Quando as pessoas, por favor, meu amigo, você tem um minuto para fazer aqui, por favor. Eu já estava dizendo que você ia ficar lá no fundo, professor. Bom dia. Então, nós vamos falar em português aqui. Também, os representantes do governo brasileiro falarão em português, haverá tradução para inglês. Quando as pessoas forem falar inglês, nós vamos ouvir aqui em português. Tá? Ok? Bom, gente, aí vocês já dizem onde é que está.
Muito pouco teto. Já está no YouTube?
Já está no YouTube.
Tá.
Alô?
Já está no YouTube, tá?
Já está aqui. Bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite. Nós estamos nesse exato momento, são 10 horas da manhã, horário do Brasil, na horário de Brasília. Estamos aqui para iniciar o encontro inaugural de lançamento do L20, que é o grupo de engajamento do mundo do trabalho durante a presidência do Brasil no G20. Para nós, aqui no Brasil, é um imenso orgulho, uma satisfação muito grande de receber este ano de 24 as 19 maiores economias do mundo, mais ainda a União Europeia e a União Africana. Outros países que serão convidados, foram convidados pelo governo brasileiro para os debates do G20. E, como disse nesse momento, estamos iniciando o lançamento do nosso grupo de engajamento, o L20, que se encerrará os seus trabalhos em Fortaleza nos dias 23 e 24 de julho. Estou repetindo, Fortaleza, dias 23 e 24 de julho, quando de fato faremos o L20 oficial. Eu estou aqui na mesa com a representação do movimento sindical brasileiro. Nós temos um tempo muito curto para fazer a nossa saudação e queria passar imediatamente. Então, quero passar, vocês podem ver, nós estamos em 6 centrais brasileiras, que eu falo pela CUT, e vou passar imediatamente para o companheiro Ailson. Guaita, faça a sua brevíssima saudação pela Central dos Sindicatos Brasileiros. Ailson, por favor.
Bom dia, sou L20, secretário de Nossas Operações da CSB. É uma honra estar aqui na sede da CUT, participando desse evento internacional e deixar registrado aqui a preocupação que nós temos com o movimento que poderia dizer que o engajamento da classe trabalhadora está sendo disperso.
Pela Central dos Sindicatos.
Quero cumprimentar toda a mesa, os representantes das centrais sindicais do Brasil, cumprimentar aqueles e aquelas que estão assistindo virtualmente e dizer que a CNTV está comprometida com os países. Nós achamos que a defesa da democracia, do desenvolvimento ancorado na industrialização e na valorização do trabalho como a expressão do trabalho decente devem ser os pilares fundamentais que devem orientar nossa atuação. Era isso. Muito obrigado. A CTV Central dos Trabalhadores do Brasil está firme nesse momento.
Delegações que nos acompanham de forma internacional. Nós mandamos um abraço fraterno do nosso presidente Moacir aos vários que nos acompanham aqui pela nossa
event via the internet. So 19 important economies of the world will be present here in Brazil, and the labor congresses will be, respective labor congresses will be represented. We, the labor movement, have to be vigilant. The far right is taking strides globally. We have to work in favor of democracy and ensure that fascism does not advance in our region, in our continent. So a hug to you all. Let's always fight for democracy against extremism. Thank you, Denilson. Ricardo Patá of the UGT, our dear friend. Good morning, brothers and sisters, friends. It's a historic, emblematic event, fundamental moment in the setting that Brazil is experiencing, where we have a policy for revaluing the minimum wage, of wage, gender parity, policy of economic development, and the most important pillar, which is democracy. With this setting and with this solidarity of all Brazilians with the other peoples of the world, we will host this debate about social economic matters, and we are opening that now with this meaningful solidarity, which will also be present next week in Uruguay, where all Argentinian workers will be in solidarity with all the Argentinian workers. This is how we have to develop in a world of advanced technology, but the most important thing is to seek alternatives to overcome the adversities experienced by workers. So social inclusion and full citizenship for all. I'm very happy to be here in this construction of a better world. Thank you. Thank you, Pata. Spoke for the UGT. Now to our friend and comrade Miguel Torres, speaking for Força Sindical Labor Congress. Good morning, brothers and sisters. I greet the Minister of Labor, Luiz Marinho. I also greet Luke Vigiani, the ITUC Secretary General, all the brothers and sisters from other countries of the G20. I also congratulate the brothers and sisters from India and other unions that had the opportunity to take part of L20 in India for the excellent organization, hospitality, and solidarity shown to shown by the Indian unionists. Hopefully, the contributions made there can be used in our gathering here in Brazil to their full benefit. After a sad and turbulent period of ferocious attacks, vicious attacks against our democracy and the labor movement, we have now turned that page. We are experiencing a different moment in Brazil with the rebirth of hope for workers and for the people, a country that goes back to the path of development, generating quality jobs with democracy always at its heart. So, brothers and sisters from China, India, Indonesia, Russia, all over Europe, Asia, the Americas, and the Middle East, on behalf of Força Sindical and our affiliates, and in conjunction with the other labor congresses here represented, we welcome you, and we are looking forward to welcome you the best way possible very soon in our country in July. So, fraternal greetings for us workers. The main thing about unionism, beyond the struggle for development, for growth, is also the solidarity, international solidarity. And for us workers all over the world, we know that for us, only the struggle can change the law. Thank you. Thank you, Miguel Torres. We, as I said in the beginning, have a very strict timekeeping for this initial gathering, which is a global virtual gathering, but is taking place here at the headquarters of the CUT Labor Congress. So we've already saved a little bit of time. Thank you all for the brevity. I would like to invite, if it's already on cue, the ambassador of Mauricio Carvalho Lírio, who is the diplomat in charge of organizing the G20 meeting. The ambassador will have 10 minutes for his remarks. Is he there? Is he here? Yes, I see him on the screen. So it's a huge pleasure to have you, Mr. Ambassador. We know of your work, of your busy schedule. We want to say thank you for taking time out to talk to us. As I said in the beginning, we are launching here the L20 engagement group, culminating the 23rd and 24th of July in Fortaleza with our official meeting, which is on the eve of the gathering of the G20 labor ministers. So, Minister, you can speak in Portuguese if you wish. Thank you. It's a great honor to take part in the launch of the L20. Can you hear me okay? I will speak Portuguese. I'll just send a quick message in English to our English-speaking listeners.
Yes. For those who do not speak Portuguese, I would like to inform you that we have translation, so I will speak in Portuguese, but there will be translation of of my presentation. Thank you very much. Antônio, muito obrigado. Para mim é uma grande
So
satisfação.
thank you, Antonio Lisboa. I'm very happy to be here with you, to talk to you. I've been in touch with you to organize the L20. So this is one of the priorities of the Brazilian government. I'm going to speak about the three substantive priorities of the Brazilian government. But before that, I have to be very emphatic in saying that as President Lula told us from the beginning, that it was absolutely fundamental that we have the engagement groups representing civil society strengthened and more listened to, with the capacity to interact with the official tracks of the G20. So it has the finance track, the engagement groups, and the L20 is one of the most important. And since last year, President Lula had already said that it would be very important for us to have a strengthening of the participation of civil society, and therefore a valuing of the engagement groups. And to that end, we have produced two innovations with the Brazilian presidency of the G20. It's very important for us to welcome the contributions for all the engagement groups better, starting by L20, which is the fact that the G20, the Brazilian presidency, lasts 1 year. It started on the 1st of December of 2023, and it goes until 30th of November this year. There are many official meetings, 120 official meetings, but culminating with the summit of leaders in November in Rio. But the preparation for all this process is long-term. The results that will be presented in November, they have to be negotiated from now, including the final declaration. So we already have planned a meeting of the so-called Sherpas, where the G20 Sherpas will receive proposals from the various engagement groups. So I can say to you, I can announce here that precisely for us to be able to negotiate better with other countries and incorporate the contributions of social society better, it's absolutely fundamental that we receive the inputs not too late in the day. There's a forecast of our presidency of starting the formulation of the final communique around July. So we have set up for the Sherpas meeting a specific session where the Sherpas will receive directly from the representatives of the engagement groups their respective contributions. So there will be room for the groups to present their contributions and to send longer written documents. So we will then have the elements as Brazilian presidency of the G20 to seek as far as possible to incorporate the contributions. Of course, it's not automatic. We have 21 members of the G20 bargaining a text. There are many different positions. So nothing is automatic, everything is bargained. But it's very important that from the get-go, we receive the contributions of the engagement groups. And of course, the L20 contributions are absolutely crucial. Furthermore, the president has also decided to hold a meeting of what we've been calling the social G20, which is a kind of gathering of all the engagement groups together in a single meeting, which would be a few days in Rio, a few days before the summit of the leaders, probably between the 10th and the 15th of November, to make sure that the engagement groups, they're very diverse. There's the L20, which is the labor sector, but there's also the women's, the youth, there's the business. So the idea is to have before the summit an opportunity for the engagement groups in all their diversity to interact and also once again convey messages to the leaders. The format of the participation of engagement groups in the summit is still under discussion. This is quite a delicate question because it involves the presence of the leaders. The Brazilian tradition, taken up again by President Lula, is to value as far as possible the direct participation of civil society in the leaders' summits. I was in Rio at the for social forum of the Mercosur. There were representatives. There were presentations directly to the presidents of the Mercosur. That would be ideal. That is not yet decided because it's not a consensus. The summit is very complex. It involves various issues, considering the variants of the Brazilian presidency in terms of intensifying, of perfecting the participation of social movements, of other civil society actors. So I want to talk about now briefly about the objectives of the Brazilian presidency, which I think have much in common with the labor priorities. One priority the president set out as a sort of an axis that cuts across all the working groups. We have 15 working groups, including one related to employment. So the theme that should cut across all the groups is the idea of reducing inequality. This is the president has said since the very beginning, the need to be involved with a theme, to remain indignant at the inequalities, and this is an effort for all. This access means access to digital resources, access to food, access to resources to carry out the energy transition. So this is an element that cuts across all the objectives of the Brazilian presidency. Furthermore, we established 3 specific priorities that go beyond the objectives of particular working group. One is a global alliance against hunger and poverty. This is something the president espoused in his first term. We have today a privileged position to be able to advance because we have the experience of a country such as Brazil that managed to leave the global map of hunger of the FAO in 2014 after years of correct policies for combating hunger, of social support. We had a president that was personally involved in the process. And I say we have now, after a few decades, we have a buildup of experience about which are the most effective social programs that actually help overcome hunger. So direct income transfers, family agriculture, school meals, keeping people in school, social protection programs more broadly. So one of the main events will be the launch of the Global Alliance Against Poverty and Hunger. The other theme is the issue of energy transition and mobilization of resources to combat climate change. What we have today is an exaggerated concentration of resources in the rich countries, the difficulty of developing countries of accessing resources to carry out their energy transitions in the sense of having full sustainability. It's not just environmental, it's also social, it's also economic, it's also labor issues related. So this is absolutely key for the Brazilian presidency. And the third theme is the question of the reform of global governance, because in a world of such conflicts, we had a record of conflicts in the world. 183, a record in the few decades. The tendency is a hyper concentration of efforts, resources, and political will, attention around the conflicts. And this diverts the political and financial capital away from the conflicts and deprives the objectives we have in terms of reducing poverty, eliminating hunger, generation of quality jobs. All of these objectives are harmed by the flooding of the international system with conflicts disseminated all over the world. So that is a problem that can only be solved with strong global governance. A strong UN capable of exerting its fundamental role, which is to keep the peace and avoid conflict. But furthermore, there are other aspects. One of them is to have the multilateral development banks the Bretton Woods institutions, IMF and World Bank, more geared to development issues, to development themes, to act in terms of reducing the bottlenecks to development and confront the major dilemmas and social problems that we all face. So, to summarize, these are the priorities of the Brazilian presidency. A defining axis that cuts across all, which is reducing inequalities, but also with this outlook that the G20, if for no other reason, to be able to realize its objectives, has to be more permeable to the participation of civil society. So a very brief set of remarks from me, but clearly I am at your disposal here in Brasilia, always at your disposal to interact. I had excellent discussions with the ITUC in Abu Dhabi, and I think that the working group on employment with the objectives geared to all these questions, but also the L20 objectives are very convergent with the overall objectives of the Brazilian presidency.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. You please feel free to stay here with us in our debate, but as we said at first, we understand how busy you can be, so feel free to stay here or not. We're definitely going to talk much more until the end of the Brazilian presidency that will take place in November in Rio de Janeiro. Now, I would like to invite our brother General Secretary for the International Trade Union Confederation, and he will now talk about the union priorities for the Brazilian presidency at the G20. But inviting our brother Luke, who must be ready as well, I'd like to invite our dear sister Alison Tat, who will be coordinating this panel. We have 35 minutes for discussion during this panel, and I don't know if Alison's ready so that she can coordinate this panel with our brother Luke. So are you all good? Alison, ready? Okay, we are now going to listen to the interpretation because they are going to speak English. For those who do not understand English, we are going to have translation into Portuguese. Thank you.
Your phone. Turn on your phone, please. Okay, Alison.
Yes, now it's working, I think. Thank you, Antonio Lisboa. Indeed, I hand directly to the General Secretary of the ITUC to open the session, and then I will happily moderate the discussion. So, Luke, I hand to you. You cannot be unmuted either, it looks like. Could the technical team help there, please? Then perhaps as that is being handled, I would just refer the participants and welcome everybody, of course, but to...
Now it works, Alison, just that you know. Okay, now I'm entitled to speak. Can I start?
Indeed, the floor is yours, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Alison. Thank you very much, Ambassador Carvalho Lirio. Indeed, we had a very fruitful debate and exchange when we met recently in the WHO, in the WTO, sorry, in Abu Dhabi, where we also had a debate about the challenges of the G20. Dear brother Antonio and dear colleagues, brothers and sisters from the Brazilian labor movement and from the trade unions. So thank you very much for giving the floor to the ITUC. So I think indeed the Brazilian G20 comes at a moment where the world needs strong leadership. Because the world is faced today with geopolitical conflicts, with a huge cost of living crisis still today for billions of people, and also with the climate crisis. And also, as the ambassador said, the world doesn't become more equal, the world becomes more and more unequal also due to these challenges. So in that sense, we welcome as I2C the three priorities of the Brazilian G20 presidency. First, focus on social inclusion and already, as said, the fight against hunger and poverty. Secondly, also the challenge and the priority on sustainable development and energy transition. And thirdly, also indeed the reform of global governance institutions. These priorities are fully in line with the I2C's call and demands for a new social contract that provide and that should provide decent climate-friendly jobs with just transition at the center, with a labor protection floor, with minimum living wages, with universal social protection, equality, and inclusion. These are the dimensions that we see as crucial for the new social contract that the world urgently needs. And to contribute to the implementation of the priorities, the L20 has put forward in its statement, and I think that it has just been shared now by Diego a few minutes ago. We have put forward a set of recommendations for governments to advance indeed towards building a just world and a sustainable planet through this new social contract. With regard to the social inclusion and the fight against hunger and poverty priority, I would like to say that social inclusion and the fight against hunger and poverty require indeed decent jobs creation through investments in job-rich, climate-friendly sectors, such as infrastructure development, care, and the green economy, but as well as the formalization of informal economy. It also requires rights through a labor protection floor for all workers with a maximum hours of work, with provisions for occupational health and safety and fundamental labor standards, and protecting also the fundamental right to strike. And also it requires establishing of minimum living wages, and promotion of wage increases will also be fundamental to lift people out of poverty. And together with universal access to social protection, it will contribute to fight the inequality and to promote the inclusion that we need in the world. Regarding the second priority of the G20 presidency, sustainable development and energy transition, for us it's clear that as trade unions, just transition is an important priority for trade unions and a strong pillar of the Brazilian presidency, as also reflected in many of the G20 work groups and work tracks. And we need a just transition negotiated with workers and employers through social dialogue to anticipate and manage climate and digital transformations. This just transition should ensure that workers are supported through social protection and trained and reskilled for the new climate-friendly jobs of the future. And new challenges arising from the digitalization of the economy and the incorporation of AI need to be addressed through a rights-based regulation that protects workers' rights. And the fight against climate change requires increasing international cooperation and climate finance. And given the fact that COP30 will take place next year in Belém, we believe, and we have repeatedly already said that the Brazilian presidency of the G20 should take this opportunity to call for a just transition summit, bringing together labor and employment ministers, the L20, but also the B20, to discuss just transition priorities prior to the labor and employment ministers meeting in Fortaleza later this year in July. And regarding the third priority, the reform of the global governance institutions, it's clear that we need to renew global governance. and financial institutions. The ILO Global Coalition for Social Justice offers a good framework for this reform that should put social justice at the center and promote a better incorporation of the views of developing countries, including in the WTO and the Bretton Woods institutions. And we also need to focus on the international financial architecture, a main demand also of the ITUC. We need to promote a more equitable and progressive tax system and fair multilateral corporate tax architecture. We need taxes on outstanding profits and wealth and a financial transaction tax. We need an accelerated process for delivering sufficient debt relief, because this is still a very important point for many developing countries. And we need an increased development aid and increased funding from development banks to promote equitable growth and climate policies. So these are the priorities that we as L20 will put forward to the G20. But the Brazilian G20 presidency will have the support of the L20 and the ITUC in delivering on these priorities. So we have high expectations, but you can also count on the support of the ITUC and the L20 in delivering on these priorities. Thank you very much. Can you give the floor back to Alison Tate, please? Alison, you have the floor. Now it works.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Luc, for both covering all the essential elements that the unions have collectively put together. And we hope that both the Brazilian presidency and our colleagues taking these to your respective governments can really shift the discussions and the outcomes of the G20 this year. 2024 is a key year for us to move these aspects where we see such a divided world in many respects. So I now open the floor. For those of you who would like to speak, please raise your electronic hand and I will take a list of people so that we can hear from you, from your own national union center or indeed Global Union Federation. We welcome your inputs now, both for commenting to the Brazilian presidency to be able to take these issues forward, and also sharing the priorities that you see within the context of the L20 statement that we have shared. It's unusual to have trade union leaders be so shy. Clearly, silence means you're all totally in agreement with the points that we have made. I see one hand being raised. Say hello, please, the floor is yours. And please introduce yourself.
I am, okay, this is FKT Korea. Very late at night. My name is Seo, and I have got L20 statement today. So I, forwarded to our Sherpa. And my question is that what could be our next step, to further develop our discussion? I'd like to, hear your suggestions or recommendations. Thank you.
Question, and it's great to hear of the unions in Korea taking this up with the Korean government. Obviously, the Korean government has been very strong in addressing investment in the green economy, in the transformation of what is needed to protect the climate and to protect jobs. And I know that the unions in Korea have been very strong in advocating and campaigning for just transition measures. So it's really great to hear your question. We You will note that in the overarching framing of the L20 statement, we speak to workers' demands for a new social contract, that Luc Triangle has just outlined some of the details of that. We need concrete action by the G20 countries. So engaging with your own labor ministry and indeed foreign ministry. And in the case of Just Transition, as Luc was saying, a Just Transition summit would really help advance the labor and environment ministers' understanding to work together at the national and indeed G20 level. We need coherence on labor issues and the social impacts, as well as the environmental commitments that countries have made. So I hope that in demanding the attention of our governments, all of us can see that the reality will require increasing investments in decent climate-friendly jobs. And we have outlined at the beginning of the statement there that likewise ensuring living wages, strengthening social protection, and implementing a just transition through a renewed and fairer international financial architecture that guarantees funding required to meet these priorities. And that is very often where the communiques of the G20 have reached their limit. The policy commitments have been stated, but the funding and the investment to make them happen hasn't come through. So we know that 2024 is a year that really requires a strong commitment to that. I see Eleanor from the ETUC. Eleanor, the floor is yours.
Thank you for giving me the floor, and many apologies from Esther Lynch, our General Secretary, who is now presiding over our own executive committee. I think what she would have wanted me to ask is a question about the danger of a return to austerity or conservative economic policies that would precisely prevent the kind of massive investments that we need in order to transition in a fair way towards a greener economy and towards collectively reaping the benefit of a digital economy in a way that is not disadvantageous to workers. There are varying degrees through which this austerity might be pursued, but the bottom line remains the same. It would entail a squeeze on countries' ability to spend for the priorities that we are collectively advancing in the and pushing for in the L20 statement. And there's a real danger. And the second question is how, again, not only how can we prevent austerity from coming back, but also how can we ensure that there is, that the infrastructure, for want of a better word, is conducive to an expansion of collective bargaining rather than a contraction of it, because that too seems to us a key to poverty, to combating poverty, and ensuring that purchasing power of wages is protected, and the more and more people are covered by the benefit of collective bargaining. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellen.
Obrigada.
I see some additional hands. Will come back to a round of responses. I hand to Carlos Müller, CTB.
Okay, obrigado.
Thank you. I'm Carlos Müller from CTB, Brazil, representing the maritime workers of ITF for Latin America and the Caribbean. I'd like to raise the issue of maritime labor, considering that the G20 countries use essentially maritime transport between our countries as means of trade, the need to be a greater effort among the G20, particularly solidarity among the workers of the G20 countries in the sense of combating the flags of convenience in shipping, which are not the flags of the countries that are actually carrying out the trade. So I want to recommend, suggest, and request that the L20 debate the question of national flags, the use of workers from the respective countries. All the G20 countries are very relevant in terms of seabound global trade and therefore of maritime labor. And I believe, as a result, that it is a theme that deserves to be approached in the L20 communique declaration.
Thank you very much for your suggestion. I see Idris Pala, KSPSI Indonesia. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, I can speak.
Okay.
Yes, I can speak.
Okay, you can speak.
Can I speak? I'm on the way. I'm on the way home.
Yes, Idris, you can speak, please.
My suggestion is law enforcement should be put on the top. Law enforcement should be put on the top. That is my proposal. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. What should be on the top?
Law enforcement should be put on the top.
Law enforcement. Rule of law. Thank you for your suggestion.
Yeah, because I'm on the way to my home, to my house. So it's not so very clear.
Okay, we got your suggestion. Thank you.
Law enforcement should be put on the top of the priority of the program or the agenda of any countries.
Thank you. We'll take you back on mute, and thank you for joining us whilst in
Yes. Thank you, Alice.
Okay. Are there others who would like to take the floor before we respond to some of
it's okay. Thank you. Thank you.
proposed? Please mute Idris. I'm waiting if there are any other additional people who would like to take the floor. Then perhaps I can go back to responding to the question put forward by Eleanor. Then I would hand to Luke. So if you could unmute Luke in preparation, please. Indeed, Eleanor, the point of austerity and of conservative economic policies is something we've been battling collectively for many years, and we have requested the G20 to take this into consideration. Obviously, in the space where we can engage with the Labour and Environment Ministers through the Labour track, this is something that has not been taken up in very coherent ways by the finance ministries of the G20. Indeed, the finance ministries and central banks meet under the finance track. So we would really hope that under the Brazilian presidency, with their commitment to addressing more progressive economic policies, then both the points you make about the imposition of austerity and the problem of active labor market policies often having austerity policies impact the very provisions of collective bargaining and the right to collective bargaining, often imposed upon by financial institutions that do not respect fundamental labor rights, is an essential part of what we have been fighting for a long time, and is clearly a high priority, not only for the ETUC, but for all those members of the G20. We know that this is a very serious attack against fundamental workers' rights and indeed the operation of democracy in our global economy. So I think that this is something that we would ask that you take up with your representatives to the G20 and to be very clear about what a priority this is for us globally. I see, Luke, I would hand to you, and then I have Roberto next in line. Luke, please.
Very much, Alison. Just actually repeating, because I indeed wanted to react to a number of remarks made. First of all, it's clear for the ITUC, we have a clear view. The world needs investments. We have huge challenges ahead of us, and we are actually already in the middle when it's about climate crisis, when it's about digitalization and so on. So we need to invest in the challenges so that we meet indeed also the targets that we need as world. But the money for getting there has not to be found through austerity. The people and billions of workers already suffered a cost of living crisis. So we don't need austerity, because that would kill indeed the transformation, that would kill indeed also the challenges and the investments in the challenges that we need. Actually, the money for paying that does not have to come from austerity. It has to come, as I also mentioned in my short introduction, for instance, through a fair taxation system. There is so much money that is going around and going to a few people, and which is completely not taxed. When the ambassador spoke in his introduction about the world getting more and more unequal, yes, the world also gets more and more unequal, and the gap gets bigger when it's about the rich and the poor. So there is a lot of money going around in the world, but get for the money where there is the money, and not in the pockets of the workers and in the pockets of those people that don't have much. Secondly, together with all our unions, we are the strongest defenders to strengthen and enlarge collective bargaining. Collective bargaining at all levels, at company level, but also at sector and at national level between social partners. So indeed, collective bargaining needs to be at the center. It's the instrument that we see how we can take part in the negotiations and in the dialogue for developing and for formulating the answers that we need for the challenges. And last but not least, I wanted to react on the rule of law principle, important. The rule of law is under threat. We as ITUC are currently doing a global campaign for democracy. One of the key principles that are today under threat is indeed the acceptance of the rule of law. It's part of democratic values. So certainly we can combine that clearly also in our demands for the G20 presidency. It's to make sure that the rule of law is respected by all G20 countries, and that there is also a recognition of this rule of law principle in their statements. For the rest, I would not react on other points that have been made. Alison, back to you.
Thank you very much, Luke. I hand to Roberto Baradel, CTR Argentina. Welcome.
Buenos días a todas y a todos. Un abrazo fraterno.
Good morning, everyone. A fraternal greetings from our General Secretary, CTA. I want to very briefly talk about points that we have to insist on and demarcate very clearly in the debate with the labor ministers. One is trade union freedom. It's a key question. Attacks are more and more common on the right to strike, on the right to organize, and this has to be a point for reflection, but also to have a clear position before the government and to have a clear position regarding the attacks on individual labor leaders. So it's what Luke said, the Global Campaign for Democracy by the ITUC is a key campaign. So that's important to highlight. The second is about collective bargaining. In many places, they don't take place. In other places, in Argentina, we had a tradition of the collective bargaining. Today, they are not being, they happen, but they are not being implemented. They're not being officialized. The government is trying to impose limits, to impose ceilings on how far negotiations can raise wages, for instance. And another one, which happened at the ILO level, which is the minimum wage. In Argentina, we have this debate. We have a special emphasis. We have to stress the question because many workers are outside of the formal economy, doing precarious work, earning less than the minimum wage. So we have to talk about precarious work, but also establish a wage floor, a minimum wage floor that allows people to survive. These are three key points. Of course, I support everything that was mentioned here. Policies, austerity policies, climate change, all of these we can get behind. But I wanted to highlight these 3 points that are fundamental for the future of the working class. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roberto. Muchas gracias. It's indeed important to link these issues of the fundamental freedoms of trade unionists to be trade unionists and to be able to take up trade union actions, and the point of fighting back on income inequality and wealth distribution. Thank you very much for making these points and tying them together. I see no other hands raised. So I think, Antonio, I will hand back to you in just a moment, but to remind our all friends that we received the inputs from you for the statement of the L20. We ask you now to take this up with your governments, and we hope that this conversation in part supports your capacity to make those arguments with your governments, to have their attention when they participate in the employment working group of the G20, as we do, along with the Business 20, the B20, where we have our voices fully heard. We can coordinate that between the Brazilian trade unions and ourselves, the ITUC and TUAC, as partners in this process. But as you know, with any advocacy work, we need you to take this up in your capitals with your ministries and with the key Sherpas who will be negotiating the text and the outcomes of the G20, both for the Labour and Employment Ministerial meeting and then going into the leaders' communique. So we have a year under the Brazilian presidency that we really hope can pick up momentum of the G20, where we really lost it under the previous year, where we were not able to participate as fully as all previous years under the Indian presidency. So we have a lot of catching up to do in a world that where workers are really at a disadvantage in terms of the 3 priorities that the Brazilian presidency has committed to: social inclusion, fighting against hunger and poverty, sustainable development and energy transitions, and reform of global governance institutions. These each are extremely important in their own right, but we know that as trade unionists, the interconnection of these is something that we need our governments to really take seriously, and that our voices are heard in the G20 this year, and that the other elements of multilateralism can be strengthened as a result of Brazil's hosting of this year's presidency. So I really thank you for your comments and inputs in this session, and we look forward to moving into the next session, where I hand to Antonio Lisboa to take it from here. Over to you. Obrigada.
Obrigado, Thank you, Alison, dearest. Thank you, Luke Triangle, and all those that made a contribution in this debate. Now we go to the second moment, which is the priorities of the G20, the social G20 and the Brazilian presidency. So we have here scheduled the president, the minister in charge of the secretary, the minister of the presidencies of the Brazilian presidency. Is the minister here? If not, we go to my dear friend and comrade Renato Simões, who is the social participation secretary of the presidency. So is it Renato? I see Renato on the screen. I believe it's Renato that will speak on behalf of the Secretary General of the Presidential, of the Ministry of the Presidency. So he's the Secretary of Social Participation, who will speak about the G20, social G20 priorities and of the presidency. My brother, you have 10 minutes. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Lisboa, brothers, sisters. Unfortunately, the minister wasn't able to arrive on time from his last schedule. Actually, was with the president, and he was delayed. So he asked me to greet you on behalf of the General Secretary's Department of the Ministry of the Presidency. We are charged with coordinating the social G20, which in our understanding is an important innovation into the traditional system of preparation and of social participation in the G20 events. President Lula, when set out the targets for the Brazilian presidency of the G20, he said that besides the main tracks, the Sherpas, the finance, which are the traditional, and obviously the working groups, the engagement groups in the preparation of the debates of the G20, we should seek also to have a higher form of expression of the interests of civil society, social movements, organized social movements, in relation to the big issues of the G20. In this regard, the president determined that beyond the two traditional tracks led by the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that we should organize the methodology of the social summit of the G20, which will take place in Rio de Janeiro between the 14th and 16th of November, prior, therefore, to the Leaders Summit. And in a way, this would allow civil society to have a protagonism, a leading role, a public leading role in the agenda of the G20. These elements are important because we will have the opportunity then to consolidate in a participative process, through a participative process, this whole preparatory work developed by the engagement groups, but to raise it to a higher level of more mass participation with digital mechanisms and in-person mechanisms for participation, and thus consolidating a voice of civil society which is louder in the face of the leaders gathering. So President Lula is keenly interested in all this, and the General Secretary's Department of the Presidency of the Republic restates the importance of the L20 in this context, not just because the president has an umbilical relationship with the trade union world, but also a recognition of the important role of the labor congresses in Brazil, the labor movement internationally as well, had in the democratic resistance against the serious crisis that we had since the parliamentary coup of 2016 against President Dilma, and particularly in the period when President Lula was under arrest. We want to take the opportunity on behalf of Márcio Macedo, the minister, to thank you all for all the solidarity that we received during this very difficult period that the Brazilian resistance was thus able to benefit from your solidarity. But there are two issues that are still present and that we're fighting hearts and minds of Brazilian society, which is the neoliberal agenda and the neo-fascist agenda, which came together in the last presidency of Brazil, which brought about huge regressions in the social and political agenda of Brazil, and also the Brazilian presence of the international setting, which helped strengthen the most regressive, retrograde, anti-worker policies at the international level.
Thus, we are going to follow closely all the L20 meetings. We hope the Fortaleza meeting is very successful, and we'd like to have an effective participation for the Brazilian labor congresses as well as the international trade union struggle for the L20 social project. So President Lula has clearly set three major areas of interest that Minister Mauricio Lira, the ambassador in charge of the G20 negotiations, he's already presented that to you. But I'd like to confirm here as something for special attention, because all the engagement groups are, of course, discussing their proposals, but the Brazilian presence would like to listen to the Brazilian and worldwide civil society on three major challenges that are set up. The first one is the line that brings together the fight against inequalities, hunger, and poverty, the social, political, economical policies, and multilateral initiatives with that goal. Secondly, face the climate emergency and abiding with the most important international agreements and moving on the agenda of green transition. And that's very important that the labor congresses are working on a fair transition, which is something that connects the environment with the social themes and the way that we understand the country as the planet as a whole. And those challenges are those faced by humankind, and it's very important to develop on this concept, as well as the themes of world governance and the relationship with peace, governance, the themes that are very threatened because of the existing governance agencies not being so strong anymore. So those three themes will be resumed after as of the July meetings, where the finance and the Sherpa lines get together here in Brazil. And these are going to be the determining themes for the G20 social, the G20 social summit. We are now agreeing with the government of the Rio de Janeiro city and state to have good conditions for the G20 social to bring together a vigorous participative process where there's not only a quality of participation, but more effective on the government response to the agendas brought up by social movements. And in that sense, it is key that we have the possibility to receive all this contribution, and that we have a continuity going from the debates that are started in Brazil with those debates that will be set up in South Africa next year. Therefore, this participation shouldn't only be a formality or just listening. This listening could be the starting point for a dialogue that will happen in different forms and instances and mechanisms of social participation that are more and more, should be more and more institutionalized on G20. President Lula and President Biden have recently given important visibility to the topic of decent labor, and the one that faces the current deregulation, precarization atmosphere that we have in the labor world. And of course, for us, this is an extremely relevant agenda that does have visibility in the G20 social. So our invite, in order to wrap up on what I have to say here on behalf of Minister Marcio Macedo, who is really keen on your work at CUT and CSI by conducting this process here in Brazil. So I am here to invite the trade union movement to propose their agendas to create social and political strength by aligning to the other groups that are engaged in the G20 process, and that you, of course, should be with us organizing the G20 social. Mr. Marcio foresees the participation of the Brazilian labor congresses in the organizing committee for the G20 social in a timely manner that will be formalized to the forum of the labor congresses, because we want to have a much closer relationship with the major social movements and the important civil society organizations in Brazil in order to receive very well all the foreign social movement organizations and raise to a very important level of visibility and attention all the agenda that we will bring into consideration for the leaders in November here in Brazil. So I wish you all the best, and do count on our Secretary, Minister Macedo, and President Lula, because our relationship with the labor movement is really important as we prepare for G20 social. Thank you very much, Renato, the Secretary of Social Participation of the Presidency of Brazil. We are now going to go to our next point, which is about listening to our brother, Minister of Labor, Luiz Marinho, on the role of Brazil in the presidency of G20. I believe he is already online. Let's see if Mr. Marinho is online and ready. I see here empty for the Labor Ministry. So, Mr. Marinho, please, you have 10 minutes for your remarks. Thank you so much.
Ok, aqui. Isso. Meu bom dia a todos.
So good morning, all my friends, brothers and sisters. Renato Simões, good morning, representing our Minister Marcio Macedo. I'd like to greet all of our friends of the labor movement. I see Clemente, Patá, my friend Lisboa, João Caires. I see Edmilson, Graça. Anyways, all my brothers and sisters from the different labor congresses, Mauricio, our ambassador, Mauricio Lira, who is the Brazilian Sherpa for the G20. I'd like to greet Moacir and all of our brothers and sisters and friends who are here with us, everybody from all the labor congresses, Luke from ITUC. It's a great pleasure to be here participating with you all. I know it's very brief, but it's important to be here in this opening ceremony. I want you to have great debates. I want you to do a very good job. President Lula is also sending his best to all of you. wishing you very good luck on your debates. And most of all, I'd like to remind the importance of the G20 debate at this very moment. That is important not only for Brazil, but also for the whole world, considering all the debates, everything that has been happening, all the opportunities to generate jobs, income, the security, equality among men and women, the end of prejudice and hatred, especially in Brazil. It is very important to debate all that. It is a privilege to be here with you today discussing the key topics for the future of labor and the society as a whole. The themes indicated by the representatives of the L20 for 2024 on their statement is a powerful summary of the concerns and aspirations of workers from all over the world. It highlights fundamental issues such as the need for a just transition into the green economy, the importance of social protection of labor rights, as well as the urgency to face inequality and precarization in the labor world. It is important to highlight the themes with those being aligned with President Lula's themes, just like ours determined by the Ministry of Labor to be debated in our meetings of our work groups. That shows that the President Lula's government is one made of workers, aimed at the well-being of workers. So one of the key messages here is the need to prioritize people in all their decisions, all the economical and political decisions. Workers are the powerhouse behind all economies, and it is key that they are put in the center of the policies, making sure they have dignified labor conditions, fair payment, and development opportunities. Plus, we highlight the importance of global solidarity as well as the cooperation among countries in order to face challenges such as climate changes, automation, and the economic crisis. These are issues that know no borders. We need to work together in order to find solutions that benefit us all, leaving no one behind. We cannot forget to mention that the international cooperation that has always been defended by our president and climate issues and social inclusion are key points in all policies of our government. It is also key to highlight the need for a fair transition into the green economy while we search to reduce our environmental footprint and facing the challenges of climate changes. We cannot forget the impact those changes would have on workers and their communities. It is key to make sure that this is inclusive and equal transition, protecting existing jobs and creating new opportunity for sustainable work. However, in order to reach all those goals, we need concrete actions from the governments, companies, the labor congresses, and civil society. As government, we need to set up policies that promote social justice, inclusion, and equality of opportunities for all. The trade union movement should keep struggling and demanding from all governments and employers to set up and enforce such policies. Currently in Brazil, in the new term for President Lula, we were able to establish a new policy to value minimum wage. We have approved the gender equality payment between men and women, which recently had the first transparency report published. We have sent a bill of law to Congress, which will guarantee the rights for pension fund protection, as well as safe working conditions for those who work through digital platforms. And we did all that opposite from what the experts predicted by creating new jobs. There was an increase of formal jobs in Brazil. Last year, we have created 1.5 million formal jobs. And in January, 180,000 new positions have been created. This year, compared to last year, we had 90,000 new jobs being created. In the month of February, we are going to be announcing tomorrow the numbers for February, and it's going to be higher than February last year. Last year, we had 251,000 jobs, and this year is more than that, getting close to almost 500,000 jobs generated in the 2 first months of this year. That works to prove that protecting the workers' income, the equality in the labor market, and protecting people is and has never been something damaging to the economy. Quite the opposite. We only get stronger as the numbers show. And this is exactly the role and importance of the work of G20 in the global economy. We only win when governments, workers, employers get together to invest on workers. When they get together to invest in education and training, as well as social protection system in order to guarantee the respect for labor and human rights in all steps of the productive chain. As a government focused on people, especially those who need the most, we have the duty and responsibility to fight for a better future for everyone. We need to get together and listen to all the voices and advocate for all the rights with grit and courage. That's the only way we can build a fairer society that is sustainable and inclusive for the present and future generations. I'd like to thank you all for being here today and for your commitment to such important matters. Together, we can make a difference and create a world where work is valued, respected, and dignified for everyone. I'd like to thank you all for being here. I'd like you to wish you very good debates in our year L20. We are also here in our government meetings. In July, we are going to be in Fortaleza, right? Exactly. So we had the ministers meeting, and I'd like to thank you all because together we are going to fight for a country and a G20 that is good for all the countries involved so that we can help by having global influence in order to build equal opportunities and a better world for all by ending hunger, poverty, like President Lula says. If we do that, we have a lot of wealth, we have a lot of food production. However, we need more income distribution. That is why our policy to value minimum wage, which starts to have an impact on the income of workers in Brazil and starts having an impact on the total salary mass, and certainly one of the engines that is creating formal quality jobs in the Brazilian economy. So these are the topics that, in my opinion, are quite relevant for our debate. Of course, transition and new energy matrices, but most of all, taking care of the people, taking care of the people in the labor market. That means taking care of quality work. I'd like to greet you all. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you to our Minister of Labor and Employment in Brazil, Mr. Luiz Marinho. I am now going to invite Maíra Lacerda, who is the chief for the international support for the Minister of Labor in Brazil. And before we go to her, I'd like to invite our dear brother, Christoph Hoffman from the Frederick Herbert Foundation, who will be coordinating this debate. So please, our brother. Well, thank you so much, Antonio. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone who are here and following us online. I am representing the Frederick Herbert organization here in Brazil. And before we listen to Maíra, I like to highlight that it is a pleasure to follow and support this process, as well as see this process where we are very much in tune when we think of the external demands and the union demands that we have, the things that we have been following. As we follow a very strong established regimen, we are gonna end on time at 11:50 Brazil time. So without further ado, we'll now listen to Maíra Lacerda, who is the chief of the international secretary for the Ministry of Labor, and then we are going to have a debate with all the people who are registered for that. So Mayra, please, you have the floor. Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for the opportunity of speaking on behalf of the Brazilian government and the Ministry of Labor, especially our international office. I'd like to start on a personal note, if you allow me real quick, and say that my very first job, was at put in the International Relations Secretariat 20 years ago. And that's together with the union leaders that I learned a lot about international relations and labor relations. So this is a very important moment in my career, just for the record. And back in the day, 20 years ago, I used to work with Jacobson and our brother José Drummond, and they actually made a network of workers in the multinational companies. Back in the day, we were dealing with ungoverned advancement of globalization that was generating precarization of labor, which still happens. And that's when we came up with a futuristic idea of creating this network of workers so that workers could defend themselves just the way companies worked back in the day, the major corporations. So it's very interesting that to be here today talking to a global network of workers, defending the labor rights, a network that in a government that does stand up for workers. We have a network that is very much aligned with the government goals, once again, in the moment of rebuilding the labor ministry as well as international relations. So just for the record, I like to say that. And I'm going to talk about the 4 priorities defined by Minister Marinho and his team for the works of our work groups in labor and our meetings. The very first has a lot to do with the goal defined by L20, which is decent labor and the creation of quality jobs as a way to fight poverty and promote social inclusion. This is a theme that is very important to all of us as at this moment of reconstruction that unfortunately we are having to deal with some negative numbers thanks to the last years that we had in government. So it's a very important theme for us. In this theme, our goal is to reconstruct the subgroup of work on equality and the value of gain of labor. We are not only studying and trying to study and create policies where workers don't only work to survive, that people do have a job, but they have quality of life and the right to leisure and culture. So that's a very important discussion to all of us. The second priority that's absolutely related to the L20 priorities is a just transition, leaving no one behind. So that how we're going to move into energy transition, digital transition, without leaving the most vulnerable workers and the most vulnerable people behind. It's a very valid discussion as well. And here we want the countries to gather us as they adhere to the Global Coalition for Social Justice of the ILO. That's one of our goals. We also have the use of technology as a way of improving the quality of life for everyone. That's another priority. For a long time in this work group on labor for the G20, we've been talking about the digital platform workers. Mr. Marinho had the idea to increase and broaden and talk about technology as a whole, because technology affects labor, not only for the digital platform workers, but we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence, automation, and how that affects labor and how people have to get prepared for that. And once again, the goal is to leave no one behind. And once again, our goal is to have a very strong writing in our statement from ministers about the protection of workers, considering automation, digital platforms, as well as artificial intelligence. And the last one, that will be the theme for our meeting tomorrow, and we're looking forward to it because it's very special to us, is gender equality in the labor world as well as diversity. Once again, we've been talking about equality between men and women in this work group on employment on the G20. However, not close to solving that problem. I guess Minister Sida talked about that during the launch of our transparency report, that it's about 300 years until we reach such equality. As we're not close to getting there, we're going to keep this on the agenda. And the minister also came up with the idea of opening up, having it more comprehensive and talk about diversity in the labor market. So we are going to ask our member countries and also the guest countries to adhere to International Coalition on Equal Pay, which is the gender parity in wages that we have. And also, we were the first country, and that's a very new thing. We were the first country to include gender and race in the data collection for this G20 group, because every year we come up with reports about the labor market of this group. So the women in the labor market, young people in the labor market, and this year, as we gathered the data, Brazil was the first country to include not only data divided by gender, but also not sex, but gender, because we want to talk about gender identity. We want the trans community to be recognized and approached, knowing that they have their rights defended. And we're also going to talk about race, because yesterday, as we launched our transparency report for the parity in wages, we saw that race is a major issue, and that's not exclusive to Brazil. Unfortunately, it isn't. So we are the first country to include that information, and we're very proud of this work, and we hope to achieve important results. I guess I have gone beyond time. That's all I have to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maíra, for spelling out these priorities. We have 30 minutes left for questions, comments, remarks. So please, if you're on Zoom, raise your digital hand. You can press the three dots where it says more and then raise hand, or write in the chat if you want to speak. It's funny because the people who aren't here are going to hear silence, forgive me. So if you have a comment or a question, raise your hand and I'll pass the floor. Antônio. In the unionists, we are normally very shy and we don't speak much. So everybody is very shy today, true to form. I'm going to start off. Firstly, I want to greet Maíra and Luis Marinho for the point you raised. I've been saying that for us in Brazil, this discussion has been very fruitful because we have an affinity. The labor movement has an affinity with the proposals of the Brazilian government. I want to stress the issue that Maíra mentioned, which is pay equality between men and women, or gendered communities generally, not just men and women. So it's very important to make a proposal, an effective proposal, based on the results in Fortaleza. Thank you, Lisboa. I want to highlight this affinity of our targets, of our importance of gender equality, which is being underscored by the Brazilian presidency. I don't see any hands raised. but we still have plenty of time. Oh, I saw briefly somebody raise their hand, but they disappeared again. Oh, here he is. Admirson, please. Over to you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Admirson, known as Greg in the movement. I'm Secretary of Solidarity Economy of the CUT, which has just been created, recently created department, created in the last Congress a few months ago. One of the questions that I think is important to raise here is the question of the construction of a new economic model. I think the solidarity economy is key when we talk about the new forms of production and new forms of accumulation as well. I believe at some point during L20 Lisboa, we are going to talk about this, which I think is a global issue and should encourage more discussion about fair trade, just transition. But I want to raise a different point, and it's good to see Maíra from the Ministry of Labor, which is human rights. We, the working class, have suffered with hate speech, violence across the world, and we need to put on our agenda the discussion of human rights, which incorporates homophobia, transphobia, misogynist violence. I don't know how this is being organized, but we have every interest in taking part. I'm part of the National Council of Human Rights, helping to build a fairer world with more solidarity, more attentive to these questions. Thank you very much. Thank you, Admirson, for raising the point of the new economic model and the human rights issue with its different dimensions. We have the next question from the panel. Good morning, everyone. I want to greet Minister Marinho, all those present, particularly the brothers and sisters and friends, unionists from G20 countries, from other G20 countries. Firstly, I want to stress the proposal, reinforce the proposal made by the sister from the Ministry of Labor. We know that for some countries, it's not an important or fundamental theme, but for Brazil it is, and for other countries. So I also want to take the opportunity of this debate of the L20 and G20 itself, that workers must have a position in defense of peace, because the war is the worst environment for workers. In the midst of war, workers can't bargain collectively, can't make demands, can't demand their rights. So peace must be an appeal of the labor movement, regardless of where war is taking place. Workers need peace and harmony to develop and to achieve better living conditions. We also must emphasize, as unions, the importance of multilateralism and of harmonious relations for development, sustainable development can become a reality, for social justice to become a reality. We need to raise our voices for social justice and democracy. We in Brazil hope that the D20, the L20 in Fortaleza, to make a contribution. The 6 labor congresses that make up the Brazilian labor movement make a contribution to the debate, and we're looking forward to welcoming our brothers and sisters, comrades, friends from other countries. Thank you. Thank you, Otélio. Yes, this is an important message because this is a turbulent period we're living through. We have another sister here, Diana. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. One issue that I think it's important to face for us is, and that is coherent with what has been said about decent work, quality of jobs, and well-being of people and workers. It's health and safety at work. It's a big problem that affect our countries and that affect not only workers in the informal economy, but workers in formal economy, workers in all sectors. And that at work, it's and the incident on workplaces are too high and have a great impact on families, on societies, and we think it's important that government, employers, and workers are engaged on these issues. We need to ask investments for the inspection and also for training. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado, Diana. Em vista também ao tempo e que não estou vendo.
Thank you, Diana. I don't see any more hands raised. Go ahead, Denilson. I want to grace Maida for her presentation, but I want to raise a different question that is important both for Brazil, I think for the region, and also for the world. What we have witnessed more and more is that workers that are protected by international legislation, national legislation, are smaller in number. In Brazil, about 40% of workers are formal workers. They are protected by the labor legislation. The number of workers that are outside, that are in the informal economy, therefore without the protections of contract, of legislation, of international convention. And the Brazilian labor legislation is very decent, but 60% of workers are outside of its umbrella's protection and outside of the public pension system also. It's important that L20 should talk about formalization of the labor market to make sure that our legislation should cover people. It's common. I was recently in Peru. The informality rate is very high there too, about 50%. This is no different in many Latin American countries. And so I think L20 should take this up and debate with more depth to ensure that there are policies to formalize the labor markets. Thank you, Denilson. I want to ask Maíra for her closing remarks. Maíra, over to you. I'd like to thank you all for your contributions, very interesting contributions and fruitful to listen to you all. I want to comment on the intervention about human rights and solidarity economy. We've just reinstated this department of the Ministry of Labor. It is on our radar, but I started off by saying that we are in a moment of reconstruction. We were abolished by the previous government. We are reestablishing the ministry, trying to think about best ways to combat the reforms of recent years and to be able to protect people. When we talk about human rights, all the questions of the L20, of the Brazilian presidency, the Ministry of Labor issues, they are all entwined with labor, with human rights. What we must be careful, I want to say this to Greg, we don't want to leave human rights, we don't want it to be too open. We want to talk about the most needy. We want to name the groups that must be prioritized because representation is important. So we need to focus. We never took solidarity economy or human rights out of the agenda ever. But there's a question of focus because women's rights, the trans community, LGBTQ, these are human rights. Of course they are. Very important things in our eyes. What Diana said about the importance of inspection for health and safety. This has a dialogue with what the brother said about informality. So we are in a moment of strengthening once again the inspection powers of the Ministry of Labor. This has everything to do with combating informality. So we are hiring, the federal government is hiring new inspectors. This is very important. As somebody said, we have laws that are robust. Our labor legislation and in many G20 countries are robust, but they need to be enforced and, abided by. We have a subgroup on health and safety in the employment group of the G20, which brings together inspections from various member countries that discusses these questions that Gianna Topetas mentioned so well. Ortélio talked about peace. I agree. We are dealing with hate speech. We must be prepared. We must defend ourselves, and we must resist this discourse. But we must also think that where there is inequality or extreme poverty, it's very hard for there to be peace. So our work as government, as unions, as representatives of social movements is to combat poverty, inequality, hunger, because a society with these things will never be peaceful. So we must fight hate speech, and this involves education, it means embracing people, resilience, patience on our part as well. Those were my comments. Thank you very much to you all for this opportunity. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here among you today. Okay, thank you, Maíra. We're very grateful for your remarks, for this debate. I want to send greetings, every tenderness to all those that weren't able to come. Okay, we conclude this block of our debate. I hand over to Antonio Lisboa, International Relations Secretary of the CUT. Thank you, Christoph. I want to ask Veronica, our dear friend, who as I see on the screen, who is General Secretary of TUAC, the Trade Union Activities Committee of the OECD. Veronica, over to you. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much, Antonio. It's great to be with you. And I also want to thank all the Brazilian trade unions for organizing this launch event, which is really important. And for TUAC, we want to support the coordination of the L20, and we really look forward to working with you all to make sure that the Brazilian presidency delivers for workers. And I think the discussion we have had today shows that many of the trade union priorities or our priorities, they do align with those of the presidency. And that's not the case every time. So that's really great. And I can't help thinking of the G20 process last year, which was very, very challenging, as you know. So I think this year's spirit of inclusiveness, transparency, and dialogue should really set a precedent for all the future G20 presidencies. And this is also true for this year's goal to advance social justice in each policy track. I'm really pleased to hear what the presidency said about how that is being mainstreamed. And I think this should be a core objective of all G20 processes. And for too many years, G20 has not really lived up to our expectations. So this is a great opportunity for us to improve the G20 and to advance on our shared objectives. But there are many challenges. As you know, today's geopolitical landscape is rather complicated, to say the least. And the G20 normally operates through consensus. So I think there will be some hurdles, and there are also elections coming up in some countries. And we know that not all governments are big friends of the labor movement. Brazil is, but not all other G20 members. So that's why I'm really insisting on seizing the opportunity that we have now with this year's presidency. And too often the presidencies, they focus on political statements or initiatives that unfortunately remain dead letters after the presidencies have passed. So I think we should really be strategic and focus on concrete deliverables that will have a long-term effect, and that can also be that we can continue to work on for the next presidency. So, for example, South Africa. And I would just like to conclude by mentioning three of these deliverables. The first is the Employment Working Group, because we have for a long time urged the G20 to address the falling labor income share. And I think with the cost of living crisis, this is even more urgent now. There's also a dramatic rise in poverty globally, including working poverty. And for the first time, global monthly wages have fallen in real terms by almost 1% last year, or in 2022. So there's really a lot to be done here, and the work being done now under the Brazilian presidency on real wage growth and the labor income share can help make this whole issue a regular item of the G20 agenda. And it's excellent news what we heard from Maya earlier today, that the presidency is going to revive the G20 Inequality Working Group, which was set up a few years ago, but then never really was operational. So it's really great that the presidency will set up discussions in this group again. The second deliverable is on taxation. This is essential in the fight against inequality and the fight for social justice. We need to increase tax revenue to finance social security systems and make sure that all people can benefit from social protection. So we call for measures to make sure that corporations pay their fair share. And it's also high time to introduce a global financial transaction tax, the FTT. And the participation of the L20 in the initiative launched by the presidency is a positive step. And I'm referring to this International Committee of Civil Society for the Strengthening of the International Tax Agenda, but more needs to be done. And we would also welcome any opportunity to participate in the G20 finance track and the working group on reforming the financial architecture. And by inviting the L20 to these discussions, the presidency would really set a strong precedent for the future. And then the last deliverable is a just transition. Many of my colleagues have spoken about it already, and I can just repeat what you have already said. We must accelerate climate action through a transition that brings social justice and protects workers' rights and livelihood. And this is really a key issue for the labor movement. And that's also what Luc said in his introduction. We need a just transition summit. This could be held in the context of the G20 Labor and Employment Ministerial meeting, and also the L20 summit in Fortaleza in July. And pushing for a just transition could also be done in the context of the G20 summit in November and through one of the presidency's key deliverables, which is the global mobilization against climate change. So to conclude, I just want to reiterate our willingness to support the presidency's ambitious agenda, including by providing input to all these key deliverables, and in particular, the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty. It's also important to explore synergies with the UN Global Accelerator on Jobs and Social Protections for Just Transition, and our call for the establishment of a global fund for social protection. So we remain fully committed to working together to further these objectives and to use the L20 as a space to engage with G20 governments to pursue our goals. We also remain committed to facilitating coordination between the L20 and L7, and together with our Italian affiliates, CGIL, CISL, and WIL, we are now in the process of preparing the L7 summit. So all the issues we have discussed here today, of course, are also very relevant for the L7. And I think I just want to highlight one, which I think we haven't spoken that much about. Luc mentioned it before, but it's about strengthening democracy. This is crucial for all our countries and something that we also need to continue to work on. But thank you so much for today, and it's really been great to participate in the discussion here. So back to you, Antonio.
Obrigado mais uma vez.
Thank you once again, dear Veronica Nilsson, General Secretary of TUAC, which is the Advisory Council of Trade Unions of the OECD. Surely we'll meet more often, and we will need more and more your support. I want to, dear brothers and sisters, I know many people woke up very early to be here to participate in our event. Many people are nearing their bedtime, but nevertheless are here. And this shows the importance and the clarity that the world of work has about the importance of having an advocacy presence in the G20 process under the Brazilian presidency. So thank you all for remaining all this time. I think it's very important and positive that we need to know how to utilize, which is, as Christoph said, which is the proximity, a similarity of the agenda of workers and their organizations with the agenda of the Brazilian government established for its presidency, which is reducing inequality, that has everything to do with us, Global Alliance Against Hunger, that has everything to do with us, just transition, that has everything to do with us. We have to think about a transition that is fair so that the poorest, most vulnerable workers aren't harmed, aren't penalized, and the impacts aren't imposed upon them. The same for a digital transition. We have to know how to make the most of this moment, to seize the moment, which is a rare moment of this similarity between the two agendas. So as I said, I'm optimistic. We unionists in Brazil, I think I speak for all my comrades here on the panel, we are optimistic about taking our declaration and affecting having an incidence on the ministers' meeting and also the leaders' meeting. This, of course, means certain challenges for us at the same time. As Veronica said, our declaration cannot stay only on paper, cannot be a dead letter. As Ortélio said, others did too. We need to be able to follow through, give continuity to the debates of the G20. G20 cannot, and its engagement groups, its tracks cannot be something that starts and finishes in the meetings. We need to make advances. The world needs changes, and so there has to be a follow through. Beyond everything that was raised here by all the speakers,
G20 at a crisis moment when we have a crisis of the multilateral organizations and institutions, all of them. One of them is not in a crisis, but I'm not going to mention that. The G20 has to also look beyond the G20 countries and the people of the G20 countries. That means what this 20 largest economies in the world do have a direct impact on the countries that are not in the G20. Next week, I will be in Montevideo on a meeting of the Americas Trade Union Confederation, and I was asked to present the G20 agenda for this confederation. It's important that here in the Americas, we have Brazil, Argentina, Canada, United States, and Mexico. Other countries were invited, such as Colombia and Chile. But we need to debate with the other countries in the Americas and, of course, the countries in Africa and Southeast Asia about our work, and under our action does generate direct impacts on those countries' economies. Therefore, the G20, in our opinion, cannot look internally only. We need to know the impacts and possibilities that we can build in order to generate a better life and a fairer world facing the multiple crises that we see in the planet. We have 2 more minutes before we wrap up, and I'd like to first of all thank ITUC again. Thanks for this environment of virtual debate. Everything worked fine. Thank you for all the production. Everybody did a great job organizing everything. My dear Patricia and the whole team, I got everything set up. Our interpreters, my friend Leandro, as well as Gustavo, and all the CUT and other labor conferences staffs. And I'd like to say that we hope to see you all in Fortaleza in July. Although I live in Brasilia, I am from the state of Ceará, where Fortaleza is, and it will be a pride to have you there, to welcome there as a host, all of you who are coming from the different places in the world. I'd like to thank Christopher for the, once again, huge contribution from this in our job. And once again, thank the presence of the Brazilian trade union movement. And we're looking forward to having all the union leaders and members from the whole world. And it's 12 sharp here in Brazil. And that's how we end our work. But we keep working. Thank you so much.